In this video, we'll be creating an arpeggiated pad sound that sounds like this. This patch will be making use of some of the unusual wavetable playback modes that are on the synthesizer, as well as some of the different noise generators that you can layer on top of your oscillators. So to create this, let's go ahead and open up a new copy of the synthesizer. Went ahead and loaded it up just to start things off. What we'll first do is go ahead and bump this over to the right. So it's basically just pointing at where the 2 is on this. And that way it's a little bit more of a square waveform. Then to make the sound a bit more interesting, we're going to change this to the jitter mode, which is all the way at the bottom. This will change the wavetable's playback engine. So it'll take the more basic square waveform and we'll adjust it to make it more interesting. Change this to the J2 mode. And then we want to change this to the P switch mode as well. So now that sounds like this. So even though I'm pressing and holding one note, the pitch is changing because it's set to this jitter mode. If I was to change that back to the standard mode, it would just play back that single note. But because we switched it to the jitter mode, it's going to adjust the pitch of that individual wavetable. The next two things we want to do are adjust the different controls on this wavetable playback mode. So we'll take the filter control and bring that down to just about there, and we'll leave the jitter where it's at. So it almost gives us a low pass filter effect. Then we want to go ahead and increase the volume on the second oscillator and leave it at its default state. So those two oscillators later together sound like this. So not like much now, but we'll be adjusting this and adding some effects to make it a bit more interesting. So next, let's go over to the amplifier envelope. Make sure the attack is all the way down, the decay is at its default state of halfway, the sustain is all the way up, and then we can bump that release up just slightly. Then we also want to layer in two different noise oscillators. So we'll take the first one, the white noise, and just bump that up just a little bit. And so far that sounds like this. And then we want to go ahead and move over to the second noise oscillator and go over to the friction category and change that over to breaking ice, which by itself just sounds like this. So I'll just turn down the rest of these oscillators real quick. So the breaking ice noise sounds like this. And then we'll take the pitch control and turn that all the way up. So it's this kind of nice top end sound that'll layer on top of everything. Bring the white noise up and then bring up the other volume of these two oscillators. And so far everything sounds like this. So it's already adding a sense of ambience to the overall sound, which is great for these types of pads. And let's go ahead and make some filtering adjustments. So we'll leave this on its default filter, but just bring the filter's cutoff frequency down. So it's basically just pointing at the K on the keyboard tracking mode. So that sounds like this. And then we want to go into our voicings tab, go over to the unison mode and change that to 6 voices of unison. And then push the stereo width all the way up. And that sounds like this. And then we also want to go over to the spread control and bring that all the way down. So we have a little bit less detuning on the individual waveforms. And then we want to go over to the chord morph and turn that all the way up. And then we want to change this to the rave set underneath chords. So go over here to chords and select rave set. And then change that to 5, which will give us this chord that sounds like this. So because we have this chord harmonization happening and also the jitter mode enabled on this oscillator, it gives us this really cool ambient melodic effect. The next thing that we want to do is add a pulse modulation oscillator. So go over to Effects Section A and go down to PM oscillator. Go ahead and change the semitone control to 12. Bring the pulse modulation down to about 35 or so %. And that sounds like this. So it doesn't sound like much right now, but we'll actually be automating this mix control a little bit later with one of the performance envelopes. Then next we want to go to the feedback control on the amplifier section and turn that up to just below halfway, and that sounds like this. So it just kind of adds some distortion and bass to the overall sound, which makes everything sound a little bit fatter. Now let's go ahead and go over to our performance envelopes so we can begin to modulate our synth patch. So go into performance envelope number 1. Create 2 different points on the envelope, bring this all the way over to the right. So at the end of 8 bars, it kind of dips down. So it's a really slow modulation. Then Then we'll have this applied to the mix control in this other oscillator. Then I also want to go over to the settings on this performance envelope and change that to keyboard trigger. And then so far it sounds like this. So as the sound is playing back, you can hear that it begins to evolve and become more distorted. Then let's go ahead and add in a really long reverb to give this sound a little bit more ambience. So go over to the reverb section, make sure the send control is turned all the way up, bring the mix down just slightly, push the size all the way up so we have a really long reverb, then push the chorus all the way up as well. And then we'll also bring the volume down so that there's no clipping problems. Then with the patch out of the way, I can go ahead and show you those notes that I played in the introduction, which again, just sound like this. So taking a look at these notes, it's a really simple note pattern. I am at 120 beats per minute. We have it start off on a G note, and that plays back for 3 bars. And then it jumps up to a D note, which is 7 semitones up from this G, and then jumps up again 7 semitones to the next G in the 3rd octave. So it's just moving up these really simple chord intervals, which creates this sort of rising tension for our sound. Another thing that's worth noting as well is I have these notes slightly overlapping at the ends, and this helps ensure that the modulation envelope doesn't reset whenever the next note in the sequence is pressed. So it resets at the very beginning of everything, and then the modulation envelope continues to play back throughout this entire 8-bar sequence, so that the sound evolves over time. If these notes didn't overlap, then that envelope would reset every single time a new note is pressed, but we only want to have it reset once at the beginning of the first bar. There's a few different adjustments too you can make to the synthesizer patch depending on the type of sound you're going for. So if we open that up, I can show you what those are. So if we look at the different noise settings that we have here, especially with this breaking ice noise that we have layered on top of everything, if you want something that's a bit more ambient like what I have here, you can keep this at its default setting. But if you want something that's a little bit more synthetic and has a little bit less of that ambience and texture on top of everything, you can always bring that down to get a little bit less of that noise. And that would sound like this. So it's a little bit softer and more synthetic sounding, but where it was before, it had a little bit more of that texture. So you can always bring that down depending on how you'd like to play back your sound. Alternatively as well, you could always route in the routing section that noise from the second oscillator into the filter section as well, if you want to cut out some of those high frequencies. Which would help make this sound a little bit more synthetic. So it just depends on stylistically what you're going for. That just gives you an idea of how you might start with customizing this patch. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.